Coming up on this Wednesday edition of Daybreak, the OECD forecasts the Korean economy to grow 3.8% next year on the back of the government's stimulus programs, but concerns about deflation linger. Dozens of people are arrested in Ferguson after the US city suffers a night of rioting following a grand jury decision not to indict a white police officer over the killing of an unarmed black teenager. Plus, the Korean government and a left-wing minor opposition party clash over a petition calling for the disbandment of the party. Daybreak begins now. Hello and thanks for joining us. To our viewers around the world, it's 6 a.m. on Wednesday, November 26th, here in Seoul. I'm Mark Broome and you're tuned in to Daybreak. And we start with that news that the OECD has forecast the Korean economy to grow 3.8% next year. This maintains the OECD's preliminary forecast for Korea that was presented earlier this month ahead of the G20 summit in Brisbane, Australia. The Paris-based organisation says the Korean economy is gradually picking up steam, with output projected to grow on the back of the government's expansionary monetary policies. It said, however, that mounting household debt could constrain private consumption going forward. The organisation says the Korean economy should grow 4.1% in 2016. The OECD cut the 2015 growth outlook for the global economy by 0.2 percentage points to 3.7%. Also with eyes on the local economy, and a state-run think tank says Korea may experience a long-term economic slump similar to Japan's slowdown in the early 1990s. For more on the growing signs of deflation in Korea, our Kim Ji-yeon reports.
There's fears Korea could be taking the same deflationary path as its neighbor Japan, which experienced a 10-year economic slump. Lee Dae-jun, an economist at the Korea Development Institute, pointed to Korea's falling prices and low inflation rates as the main reasons for drawing the comparison. The country's consumer prices remain trapped in the 1% range for a full 2 years due to low demand, recording well below the government's target of 2.5 to 3.5%. It's a dismal sign, as sluggish demand was attributed as the main reason for deflation. In Japan's case, in the early 1990s, dragging down the country's real estate prices and its GDP deflator, which measures the prices of all domestically produced goods. Much like Japan, Korea's GDP deflator increases are dipping low into the 0% range this year after it first started to decline in 2011. The researcher warns Seoul should be more vigilant and take preemptive measures to tackle the country's low inflation rate, such as cutting its main benchmark interest rates. He adds it's important Seoul takes into account the downward trend of real wages and expected inflation when making decisions on its monetary policies. In 1995, Tokyo lowered its policy interest rate by 0.5% to turn the economy around from recession, but the effect was short-lived as the country's real interest rate went up due to deflation. The Bank of Korea will announce a decision on December 11th on whether to further lower the current interest rate of 2%, following previous rate cuts in August and October. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
Now, adding to the economic pinch the country is feeling, Korea's snowballing household debt has unfortunately hit yet another high. The Bank of Korea says the amount of household debt, which refers to credit purchases and loans extended by financial institutions, stood at roughly $950 billion as of the end of September. That's a growth of about $20 billion just from the end of June alone. The record debt stems from the government's deregulation drive in the housing sector and a lower key interest rate, which worked in tandem to boost housing loans. Now, more mothers in Korea are staying at home with their kids full-time. There's a slew of reasons for this, of course, including economic, cultural and personal ones. But overall, it means there are far fewer working mums in Korea than there are in many other countries in the OECD. Our Lee Ji-eun reports.
Getting married, giving birth, and raising children all seem to be keeping Korean women from working. In its latest report, the Korea Economic Research Institute compared the country's economic activity rate to that of 7 OECD member countries. The economic activity rate measures the proportion of the working-age population who are working or are available for work or training. The 7 leading OECD countries, which include the United States and Japan, all have populations of more than 10 million and an average employment rate of 70%. For Korean women between the ages of 25 and 54, the institute says the economic activity rate stood at about 63%. Compare that to the average of 76.2% for the 7 OECD countries, and you have an over 13 percentage point difference. The employment rate for women in Korea wasn't any better. A little over 60% of them are currently employed, while the average employment rate for Korea's 7 OECD counterparts was nearly 72%. While women in Korea are struggling to stay in the job market, the employment rate for Korean men was actually a bit higher than that of the 7 OECD countries' average. Older people in Korea also seem to be working more than ever as the country's aging population is growing. Korea's economic activity rate, as well as the employment rate for people aged 65 or older, was more than double the average for the 7 OECD countries. Experts say the government needs to introduce a more flexible work system for women, so they're willing and able to work even after having a child. They add reducing the wage gap with men might also help, while also lowering the cost for marriage and childbirth. Lee Ji-eun, Arirang News.
Staying with economic news, the profitability of non-finance-based Korean companies last year fell to its lowest level since the 2008 global financial crisis, according to data from Statistics Korea, which does not include financial and insurance companies. The nation's construction and transportation firms fared the worst. The data, based on a survey of more than 120,000 firms here in Korea, showed that companies made an average of 39 won in net profit last year for every 1,000 won worth of sales. This is the worst number since 2008, when companies turned an average profit of 32.5 won per 1,000 won in sales. The agency attributes the sluggish profitability to the tough economic conditions out there and increased competition in global markets. Korea's Constitutional Court listened to the closing arguments Tuesday in the case against the left-wing Unified Progressive Party, which is accused of very serious charges, conspiring with North Korea to overthrow the South Korean government. Ji Myung-gil reports.
The Constitutional Court on Tuesday heard closing arguments in a trial that will ultimately determine whether the minor opposition Unified Progressive Party will be forced to disband over accusations it had plans to overthrow the government. Justice Minister Hwang Kyo-an, speaking on behalf of the state, told the court that the UPP based itself on a political doctrine that violated South Korea's constitutional order. He claimed the party's political objective was to instigate a rebellion against the government and achieve a federal form of unification with Pyongyang. Chief of the UPP, Lee Jung-hee, countered and defended her party before the court, saying it had no affiliation whatsoever with North Korea and that the government was guilty of political suppression. The accusations date back to last year when lawmaker Lee Seok-gi and 3 UPP members were arrested on charges of plotting to topple the South Korean government and blow up major government facilities in the event of a war with the North. They are still awaiting a Supreme Court ruling on those charges. The Constitutional Court did not decide when they will deliver the ruling. to determine whether the UPP will be allowed to continue on as an official party. If they are forced to disband, it will mark a first in Korean history. Chimyeong-gil, Arirang News.
Now, after 4 years of banning the provision of any fertilizer aid to North Korea, Seoul says it's now willing to consider easing sanctions and helping out its northern neighbour, but only if Pyongyang guarantees transparency. Speaking at a forum on inter-Korean cooperation on Tuesday, Unification Minister Ryu Kil-jae said South Korea is considering measures to help North Korea's agriculture and forestry industries. He said Seoul is willing to take the first step for the two Koreas to build trust and hopefully break down the barriers to friendship. South Korea banned rice and fertilizer aid to North Korea in 2010. This after the North torpedoed the South Korean warship Cheonan in the same year. North Korea says it's on the same page as Russia when it comes to pushing for no preconditions to resume the long-stalled six-party talks to denuclearize the Korean peninsula. The North state-run Korean Central News Agency says Special Envoy Choi Ryong-hae's recent trip to Moscow improved the two countries' ties. They also agreed to expand cooperation in various fields, including holding a joint ceremony next year to celebrate some very significant milestones in their respective histories. North Korea is going to commemorate the 70th anniversary of its independence from Japan's colonial rule, while Russia will mark the 70th anniversary of its victory against Germany in World War II. Pyongyang's move towards Moscow comes as its ties with its traditional ally Beijing are increasingly strained. South Korea is set to announce the size of a second team that will be sent to Ebola-hit Sierra Leone. Seoul's foreign ministry says it will make its decision based on the assessment of the first team, which returned from a week-long trip to the West African country just last Friday. The ministry adds that the next deployment is scheduled to leave for West Africa in mid-December. Reports suggest the team may be comprised of up to 20 medical personnel who will stay in Sierra Leone for around 3 months. Well, it's time now for a look through the global headlines we're following on this Wednesday morning here in Seoul. For that, we turn to Eunice Kim, standing by at the news centre. Good morning, Eunice.
Hello, Mark. Well, the violence has subsided, but the anger is still very much alive in Ferguson, USA, as the country takes in the grand jury decision to not send white police officer Darren Wilson, who shot and killed black teenager Michael Brown, to trial. People woke up to an eerie silence on Tuesday morning after a night of mayhem and riots that overtook peaceful protests to destroy parts of that community. St. Louis County Police said about a dozen buildings in the Midwestern town, many of them private businesses, were burned down. A no-fly zone was issued for a time over Ferguson as rioters shot at least 150 rounds. There were no reports of fatalities. Shortly after the no indictment decision was announced by County Prosecutor Robert McCullough, Michael Brown's family released a statement saying they were, quote, profoundly disappointed that the killer of our child will not face the consequences of his actions and urge those who share their pain to, quote, channel their frustrations in ways that will make a positive change. We need to work together to fix the system that allowed this to happen, end quote. Officer Darren Wilson, who you just saw there, was among the about 60 witnesses whose testimonies the grand jury considered. He told the 12-member jury he had felt that his life was in danger at the moment of shooting the unarmed teenager. In Hong Kong, police have arrested dozens of pro-democracy protesters who refused to comply with a court order to clear out of the protest site in Mong Kok. Reuters reports riot police detained 80 protesters after several thousand demonstrators took backstreet barricades on Tuesday following a partial clearance. Despite the police action, many demonstrators said they remain defiant in their fight for fully free elections. Local media say a separate court order has been granted to clear out an even larger part of Mongkok on Wednesday. Pope Francis in Europe for the second time since his election had some blunt words for the continent. Addressing the European Parliament, he described the continent as a, quote, grandmother, no longer fertile and vibrant, but rather, quote, somewhat elderly and haggard, saying it risked slowly losing its own soul. He urged the government to re-energize Europe, to go beyond the bureaucratic technicalities of its institutions and return to the great ideas which once inspired Europe. His visit lasted only 4 hours, the shortest trip any pontiff has made abroad. And finally, the U.S. economy appears to be continuing on its recovery streak. The country's Commerce Department said on Tuesday, or rather it raised its expected third-quarter GDP growth to an annualized 3.9% from the 3.5% rate reported last month on the back of improvements in business and consumer spending. That would mark the strongest 6 months of growth the U.S. economy has seen in more than a decade.
We start before the sun rises to bring you the latest stories out of Korea. We also lead the way with important global coverage. Stay on the pulse of what is happening with Daybreak.
Now, wearable technology is being touted as the next big thing. We're yet to see any significant breakthrough, but researchers from Korea and the United States have developed a kind of sticky sensor that, when used in conjunction with wearable technology, could make it much easier to detect heart attacks and/or strokes before they strike. Gwon-soa reports.
The high potential for wearable technology has already been predicted by market watchers. And apart from making life more comfortable and fun, it could eventually be a lifesaver. A joint research team from Korea and the United States recently developed a sensor that can be stuck to your skin like a band-aid and could provide early detection of cardiovascular diseases such as heart attacks or strokes. Tens of thousands of microcilia, or hair-like extensions of cell surfaces, have been bedded into a sensor the size of a fingernail. These can then measure fine waves in blood vessels. When integrated with smartwatches or other wearable devices, it'll become easy and efficient to monitor one's health, especially since strokes and heart failure can strike suddenly.
While it was difficult to respond to emergency cardiovascular diseases with existing equipment, due to their complexity and high price, the new wearable sensor will be able to help in emergency situations.
Cardiovascular diseases are the leading cause of death in the world. The World Health Organization forecasts more than 23 million people will die of heart attacks or strokes by the year 2030. Cost-effective wearable sensors could be the answer for low- and middle-income countries, as 80% of CVD-related deaths occur in that group. Gwon-soa, Arirang News.
Now, taking public transportation is usually a bit of a chore, a bit humdrum, but certain forms of mass transit in Seoul are getting a bit of an animated makeover to make them a little easier on the eye. Take a look around, and if you're lucky enough, you might spot Korea's most famous cartoon penguin, Ebola, in a place you'd least expect it. Our Connie Lee reports.
Ebola, the little penguin with his yellow helmet and orange goggles, is now coming to you in taxis. Starting Tuesday, 20 of these so-called Ebola taxis are running on the streets of Seoul. From the outer decorations to inner car accessories, Ebola and his friends have taken over these cars, much to the delight of Korean children. No wonder Ebola is also deemed the children's president. Passengers can ride with this popular animation character for a test period until May of next year.
We came up with this idea when we were thinking about how to increase people's use of taxis, even if it's only by a little bit.
The fares for these Wearable taxis are the same as other regular taxis in Seoul, and because there are only a handful available, reservations can be made online. Wearable is just the latest animated TV character to be featured on public transportation in the capital. Tayo, the little bus, has been literally running the streets of Seoul since March, and with its huge popularity, the one-month test term has been extended until the end of this year. And the larva character is plastered all over a train on Seoul's subway line 2, entertaining the eyes of passengers since the beginning of this month. Seoul Mayor Park Won-soon says the coming of life of these characters is a way to decorate the city. And of course, please the little ones. Connie Lee, Arirang News.
And a good Wednesday morning to you all. Now, it's no surprise that the Korean national football team needs a lot of work ahead of the Asian Cup set to take place in January. So on Tuesday, manager Uli Stilke announced that the team will meet again mid-December for a special training session. And of course, with the winter season just around the corner, the national team members will begin their special training session in Jeju starting on December 15th for a week-long training camp. Manager Uli Stilke stated that a lot of work is needed and that he will choose 23 players to take part in the camp and travel to Australia for the Asian Cup. Meanwhile, the 2015 Asian Cup will kick off on January 9th. Stand-in football moved over to Europe, where the shortlist for the 2014 UEFA Team of the Year were announced. Now, in a list of 40 nominees, unfortunately, no Korean footballers were nominated to be voted, but nonetheless, a number of big names made the list. And while Manchester United and Arsenal only produced one player each, Bayern Munich had the most nominees with 9 players on the list, with Real Madrid coming in second with 8. Now, it might not be as big as the World 11, but it might be the second biggest honor to be voted. And shifting over to some winter sports this time, history was made as Moon Ra-young won Korea's first medal in women's skeleton competition. Now, the 18-year-old did finish 6th at the third stage of the America Cup, but medals are given to the top 6 finishers. And now with that, believe it or not, we're already approaching the end of 2014. And with that comes a number of awards given out to athletes. But on Monday, Korea University held their athletic awards ceremony as several big-name athletes were honored. And with that, figure skater Kim Yeon-ah and golfer Kim Hyo-ju were given the Pride of Korea University Award, given to athletes from Korea University who make the school proud of their accomplishments. Of course, earlier this year, Kim Yeon-ah retired from figure skating after the Sochi Winter Games, marking an incredible career on ice, while Kim Hyo-ju capped off an incredible season in the KLPGA, winning 4 different awards, along with 4 major victories, including the LPGA Avion Championship title. And finishing things off, you might be a fan of the Samsung Lions, the LG Twins, the Doosan Bears, and so on. But everyone in Korea is a fan of the Goyang Wonders, the first independent team in Korea. But on Tuesday came their final practice. The Goyang Wonders, who became the first independent team back in 2009, disbanded this past September due to a lack of funding. And while most of the players on the team signed with KBO teams, the last remaining 11 held their final practice on Tuesday before saying their goodbyes. Now, despite being a small part of baseball in Korea, they truly were a huge part in every fan's heart. And best of luck to all of them, and that is going to wrap it up for me. This has been SJ. Have a great rest of the day, and see you guys again for your sports needs.
Good morning. I'm Lee Ji-yeon here with your latest weather updates. It's a bit cooler morning we are waking up to, but it still feels mild as the current temperatures are at about 8 degrees Celsius here in the capital, and afternoon highs will hover in the mid-teens, rising to the same readings as yesterday. And right now we are looking at lots of clouds coverage, even raining in some parts in Jeju, but things should clear as the morning goes on, and it will be a bright afternoon. With that in mind, let's take a closer look at the readings for today. Now, the low in Seoul is starting out at 6 and the daytime high will peak at 14, while Daegu and Gwangju will rise to 15 and Busan will climb to 16 this afternoon. And as for the other regions, Jeju Island and Daejeon will be getting up to 14 and Dokdo should see a high of 11, while Mount Kunggang tops out at 5. Well, that's all for Korea, and here's international weather for viewers around the world.
Well, that does it for this Wednesday edition of Daybreak. Korea Today is coming up at the top of the hour, 7 a.m. Korea time. Goodbye.